Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here. I have the pleasure of introducing Jim Grant, who is my hero. I've introduced him once before. When I was a banker, I brought him to St. Louis. I was president of UMB in St. Louis, and my daily reading, it was some people go to mass to start their day off correctly. I used to read Jim Grant's Interest Rate Observer before breakfast in order to start my day right. James Grant and my father are the two people who taught me the most about the markets, about the bond market. My creditors would like to meet them. But really, actually, there are a handful of Kempers, notably my father and myself, and Jim Grant. For a while, Robert Shiller at Yale, but then he became an advisor to the Federal Reserve, and was a version of regulatory capture, and he lost interest in telling the truth. But if you had listened to Jim Grant from the pretty much any time on, from the early 90s or the early 80s, or you would have understood what's happened over the last three and a half years. It is true that it could be said of him that he's predicted 15 of the last 4 bond market collapses. Thank you. Yeah, would you all like some coffee? Or, but that's 2 less than my father. So. He is. I think that he is the wisest of commentators on the market because he's the most truly skeptical. He's skeptical of all the various isms, the various schools of thought. He's the ultimate realist about the markets, and that's translated into great columns in his Interest Rate Observer and for Forbes and other places that he's written, and also into some really wonderful books. My favorite is Money of the Mind, of which a reviewer said that it's like writing it's basically a history of credit, and one reviewer said of it, it's a little bit like writing a history of the interstate highway system from the point of view of the accidents. And I have to say, it seems to me that that's exactly right, because it's how you handle the accidents on the interstate highway system. It's how you handle the collapses, the stupidities of the various government programs, or the various moments of, in the words of one of his other books, when Mr. Market miscalculates. That the system really works. Our system, in fact, has worked pretty well, I think, but it is constantly subject to the foibles of man and government, and Jim Grant has been perhaps the best biographer of that. Money of the Mind is, in my view, still the best history of credit and what I would call the democratization of credit. Actually, probably Jim said that, and I'm plagiarizing him, but I haven't looked at the book in a while. The democratization of credit and the good things and the bad things about that, and that's typical of his writing. He is just, he is fair, and he is sanguine about most things, except the fact that human nature inevitably erupts. But now I have to tell you that I've got a bone to pick with him about his current subject. He's a great biographer. He wrote a biography of Bernard Baruch many years ago that's still a standard topic on that unique character who was so important in World War I and World War II finance, was the original legend in his own mind. And then he wrote about the same time that guy David McCullough wrote a biography of John Adams. James Grant, decided to compete with that. He wrote a great biography of John Adams, which needs to be better known because of that shadow of that giant from the Cape. And now he's written, and this is where I have a bone to pick with him. Now he's written a biography of Thomas Brackett Reed, and Thomas Brackett Reed is the greatest American politician you've never heard of, but I'd heard of him. In fact, I wrote my senior essay about Thomas Brackett Reed, my senior essay at Yale, and I've been working on my biography of Thomas Brackett Reed ever since. So I'd like to read to you from the first. Actually, of course I won't do that, though. This is a wonderful book. I'm about 2/3 of the way through. I haven't quite finished it. But Reed is such a great character. He was the wittiest man in American politics in the second half of the 19th century, maybe the wittiest man in American politics ever. And he was also a man of conscience. And Jim Grant will tell you about that, and I don't want to get in the way of that. But I do want to say that he was one of the few people, he talked about the importance at the end of his life, reviewing his life. He talked about the difficulties and the importance of melding your conscience with partisanship. He was a great believer in the party, a great believer in the importance of parties. But at the end of the day, as Jim will tell you, he resigned as Speaker of the House as in some ways the most powerful man in America because his conscience wouldn't let him go on. And I'll leave that story to Jim. But he's a man whom I've always admired. Not least, I will quote from the book, he was involved in helping the Library of Congress to expand itself at one moment in his career, and a gentleman got up on the floor of the House and said half of the books in the Library of Congress, this by the way is something I hear periodically from patrons of this library, were worthless. And he said, I say that in a great library, no book is useless. In a great library meant for a great nation, every printed thing ought to be, and nothing pertaining to a library is out of place. What is trash in my library is not trash in the library of another man. Now, there speaks a very eloquent man who understood what libraries were all about. And now I get to introduce to you a man who is very eloquent on the subject of this man, who's always eloquent on the subject of the markets. He studied at the University of Indiana, and he studied with, and obviously that man has had an impact on this book, Robert Farrell. And Bob Farrell is a friend of mine, a mentor of mine as well. Bob Farrell has written one of the Truman biographies. Those of you who are Truman fans will know that Bob is, and he regularly writes. He's 87 or 88 now, and he's still writing a book a year. And many of them Truman and the Farm, for instance, or subjects from World War I that he writes about a lot in association with Liberty Memorial and resources there and here at this library. And he's a mentor of Jim's from his days at the University of Indiana. So as you can tell, I have a lot of connections to this talk, but especially to Jim Grant as a sage. The man you're about to hear is a sage of the bond market. He's a sage of American history. He's a great biographer, a great writer, and one of the wittiest men in America. So it's a privilege to have James Grant here at the Public
Library. Hey, in turning down an invitation to speak at the Harvard Law School, Thomas Reed, my invisible friend, the great Republican Speaker of the House, said that the pleasure of consenting to make a speech and the trouble to prepare it are like, with a woman, the difference between conception and delivery. So, ladies and gentlemen, I consented to make a speech, but it was no trouble at all to prepare, rather a pleasure. Mr. Reed, my subject this evening, and my friend, albeit an invisible one for the past several years, is some of the best company you can possibly keep. I'll know I've succeeded if you wake up tomorrow morning wishing you could take him to lunch to discuss perhaps the American annexation of Hawaii, or the imperative of the gold standard, or the inadvisability of a war of choice with Spain, which of course is impossible. He was Reed, in Portland, Maine in 1839, and he died in Washington in 1902. The discerning voters of the 1st District of Maine elected him to the House at every opportunity from 1876 to 1898. He was Speaker 3 times. It was, he said, an office without peer and with but one superior. Czar Reed, as his antagonist called him, he seemed not to mind this epithet at all, was perhaps the greatest speaker, or tied with Henry Clay and James G. Blaine for that distinction. Certainly, Reed was the greatest sardonic speaker and possibly the greatest funny American statesman, not excluding Abraham Lincoln. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed as much as 300 pounds, though he dryly insisted that no gentleman ever weighed more than 200. He controlled the House through his mastery of parliamentary tactics and also by wit. If there is one thing for which I admire you more than anything else, Theodore, Reed once told the earnest young Teddy Roosevelt, it is your original discovery of the Ten Commandments. And as the curtains were drawn to reveal the portrait of Reed that his colleagues had commissioned from John Singer Sargent, not one of the painter's best likenesses, the disappointed subject remarked, well, I hope my enemies are satisfied now. That was in 1891 when Reed's enemies were legion. It was at the end of his first term as Speaker, and he had done something that the minority party judged unforgivable. He had unfrozen the seized up legislative machinery of the House of Representatives. It happened this way. Until that revolutionary moment, an obstructionist minority could silence the House. The Constitution requires that no business be done without a quorum, but it doesn't say what a quorum is. Is it enough that the members be present, or do they have to acknowledge their presence by answering the roll call? Since time out of mind, a silent member was constitutionally absent. Reed changed that by uttering the following short sentence early in the 51st Congress in early 1890. Said Reed, the chair directs the clerk to record the following names of members present and refusing to vote. And he called out the names. And then what happened was pandemonium. I won't ruin the book because it might harm the sales by telling you what happened next, but you won't believe it. You won't believe it. In those unreformed days, the House was bound hand and foot by its own rules. Sadly, it was not also gagged. For weeks on end, at the pleasure of a recalcitrant minority, the main order of business could consist of parliamentary fencing and the droning repetition of roll calls. Each roll call absorbing 25 interminable minutes. So unproductive was the 50th Congress that near the top of its list of achievements stands the institution of the United States Department of Agriculture. It could have been worse. It could have founded the Fed. So loquacious were its members that they contributed 13 million words to the congressional record as recently as 1859-61, the 36th Congress debating war and peace, union and secession, freedom and slavery. The 36th had made do with just 4 million words. So when the Republicans recaptured the House in the election of 1888, they made Reed their speaker. He sprung his parliamentary surprise in January 1890. The immediate spur to action was a Democratic attempt to obstruct a vote to decide the winner of a contested election in West Virginia. The Democrats were certain to lose that vote as they were any partisan contest, for they were outnumbered by the Republicans 166 to 154. They therefore chose to deny the majority a quorum. When the clerk called their names, they sat mum. Since 165 members made a quorum, virtually every Republican had to be present in order to push through any but the least controversial bill. Barring a drastic revision of the rules of the House, the 51st Congress would be no more productive than its hopeless predecessor. But Reed effected just this transformation. When the clerk called the names of the members in the vote on the West Virginia question, the Democrats bit their tongues, as the minority party in such circumstances had always done, and the Republicans indeed had done it when they were in the minority. But Reed, noting them seated at their desks, counted them present just the same. After Reed hurled this thunderbolt, our politics have never really been the same. Quote, I deny the power of the Speaker and denounce it as revolutionary, cried William C.P. Breckinridge, the Kentucky orator. I deny your right, Mr. Speaker, to count me as present, boomed another furious Kentuckian, and I desire to read from the parliamentary law on the subject. to which Reed laconically replied, "The chair is making a statement of the fact that the gentleman from Kentucky is present. Does he deny it?" So Republican laughter drowned out Democratic cheers. For 3 days before packed public galleries, the clerk read the roll, which the Democrats refused to answer. And for 3 days, Reed answered for them. Sometimes the House was out of order for 30 minutes at a time. 30 minutes. The Speaker was a study in imperturbability, even when the Democrats read into the record a certain Republican's definition of a constitutionally sanctioned quorum that exactly accorded with their own. It said, quote, "A majority of the members present and participating in the business of the House. It is not the visible presence, but their judgment and votes which the Constitution calls for," close quote. And who was the author? Who was the author of those ringing phrases? Why, none other than Thomas B. Reed of Maine. They came to him years before these words did, when the Republicans were in the minority. Well, the gentleman from Maine had changed his mind. Majority rule is the very reason for representative government, the GOP now insisted. William McKinley, the White House-bound Republican from Ohio, who now lined up behind Reed, lashed out against the tyranny of the minority. It was infinitely more odious and intolerable, and more to be feared than that of the majority, said McKinley. The sardonic Reed reformulated the earnest and museless McKinley by saying that the best system of government is, quote, "to have one party govern and the other party watch." And on general principles, I think it better for us to govern and for the Democrats to watch. On February 14th, 1890, Reed presented to the House, and the House enacted a set of rules to control the abuse of dilatory or delaying tactics. The Supreme Court upheld the Speaker, and in a development very, very sweet to read, the Democrats themselves adopted his rules when they were returned to power. As Speaker, Reed had exercised the immense powers of that office. He had controlled the legislative traffic in the House. He had determined which members would be allowed to speak and on which committees they would serve. He was an all-powerful Democrat before he unilaterally reformed the rules on obstruction. Thereafter, he became an autocrat, benign or otherwise, according to one's party affiliation. Socially, said one of the Democrats, Reed is a mighty good fellow. Officially, he is a brute. A wistful American taxpayer might sometimes regret that obstruction was not given a longer trial in the nation's capital. Reed's unshackled 51st Congress holds the dubious honor of becoming the first to spend $1 billion of your money or your forebears' money. To William S. Holman, long-serving Democrat from Indiana, goes the prize for political divination. He foresaw that the Reed rules would tend to produce a bigger, costlier, and more intrusive state. Quote, "a great navy, an enlarged army, a great zoological park, and other embellishments in this city, and all else that creates a splendid government and gives a sense of security to the owners of overgrown and imperial estates who have no faith in the people and long for a stronger government." Not long ago, the Wall Street Journal reported on the findings of a new opinion poll that showed Republican voters now opposing free trade by a margin of nearly 2-to-1. Reed would have welcomed the news as a sign of the party's return to first principles. In his day, the GOP was the party of protection. It favored tariffs high enough, so the argument ran, to insulate American wages and American profits from foreign competition. The American market was almost sufficient unto itself, Reed and the GOP contended. The case for free trade they regarded as a special pleading of British economists, impractical American academics, and memories of the Civil War still vivid, the wretched former Southern slave drivers. To give a feel for the sectional feelings that persisted long after Appomattox, please listen to one of the leading Republican protectionists attack a tariff reduction measure sponsored by a certain Texas Democrat. Here is what the Republican said. "Mr. Chairman," declared William D. Pig Iron Kelly of Pennsylvania. Pig Iron was the product about which he never stopped talking and about which he sought to protect against foreign competition. "Mr. Chairman," said Representative Kelly. Having devoted the years of my vigorous manhood to the overthrow of the political influence of the slave oligarchy, I intend to devote my remaining years to the emancipation of its political affairs from the fatal embrace of the most fruitful source of poverty, ignorance, vice, crime, disease, insanity, and ignominious death known to the civilization of the 19th century, and whose subtle and insidious power is arrayed alike against the mining and manufacturing interests of this country and the diversification of agriculture. Close quote. Kelly was referring to the Democratic Party. It was the Democrats in those days who championed free trade and a small national government as a first step towards reducing the perennially burdensome federal budget surplus. Now, there was a problem. It supported lower tariffs. The aforementioned William S. Holman, the 15-term Indiana Democrat, was a leading exponent of these ideals. Now, Holman would not pay a nickel to see an earthquake. He was cheap. He was the proclaimed or self-proclaimed watchdog of public spending. He regarded himself as an heir to the life and thought of Thomas Jefferson. In counterpoint, Reed in fiscal affairs may be seen as acting in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton. Billion-dollar Congress, the man from Maine would repeat when the epithet was hurled at the record of the 51st Congress. This is a billion-dollar country, he said. It was Reed who, in the early 1880s, championed the construction of a new building for the Library of Congress over the objection that for the taxpayer's sake it would be cheaper just to burn half of the collection of books. Reed wanted to know what half. Of course, little spenders sometimes laid aside their principles in order to attend to the needs of their own constituents. When the saintly Holman, the watchdog of the Treasury, stooped to propose a pork barrel measure for the benefit of his Indiana district, Reed would let him have it with both barrels. And when Holman rose to defend the outlay, Reed, in mock humility, would apologize for his failure to realize that the taxpayers' dollars were to be spent in the district of the watchdog of the Treasury. Or the speaker would simply quote from the Holman-baiting lines contained in Lord Byron's Don Juan. Quote, this is what was said in Congress after Holman, the watchdog, had given his talk in support of his own outlay of the taxpayers' money. Here's what was said, quoting Byron, "'Tis sweet to hear the watchdog's honest bark, bay deep-mouthed welcome as we draw near home." And with these lines, the House burst into laughter, and for the first time, perhaps on record, a bill was defeated with humor. To a 21st century observer of the 19th century in American politics, the ideological dividing line between the two major parties may seem indelible. The Democrats were the Libertarian Party, whereas Republicans were the interventionists, but it did not seem so indelible to Reed. His Republican Party wrote the legislation that brought America into the modern age, said he. His Republican Party wrote the legislation that created the national banking system, the national currency, American transcontinental railways. It was the defender of the Union, the protector of American prosperity, and the champion of African American suffrage. It was the Progressive Party. That was his GOP. There can never be two parties. There can never be but two parties, said the speaker in 1896, the creating party and the retarding party. The Progressive Party may be unwise in its progress, and the retarding party may be unwise in its conservatism. But both serve a good purpose, and between them, both the world slowly and safely moves ahead. Dreadfully slowly sometimes, but it does always move ahead. That was Reed's view on partisanship. Reed was a career politician, but not of the garden variety. He owned no home in Washington, but rented rooms at the Shoreham Hotel. In middle age, he made a study of the French language. He kept a diary in French and paid a French tutor to sit with him and talk. He built the biggest private library in Maine. And he was unusual, too, in his ambition. He had designs in the presidency and sincerely believed he could win it. The election of 1896 was his time. He had the support of Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge. among other leading lights of the GOP. He stood four square with the party and its platform, including its endorsement of the gold-backed dollar instead of a more prolific and inflation-prone silver one. But Reed refused to play the presidential game as Marcus A. Hanna, who was the Karl Rove or the Rahm Emanuel of his day, was redefining that game. Others could solicit donations or promise prospective supporters a place in a new administration. Reed was above that. He was above that. Hanna, who worked for the museless McKinley, had sent his agents to mingle in the Western crowds when Reed arrived to speak during the 1896 campaign season, and the verdict these spies returned was highly favorable for McKinley. There was nothing Lincolnian about Reed, obese, sarcastic, and dapper, Hanna's biographer recorded. He wasn't too friendly when they came up to shake hands after meetings either. He was an Eastern product. When McKinley did win the nomination, Reed wired his congratulations, quote, "I wish you a happy and prosperous administration, happy for yourself and prosperous for the country." The 1896 election turned on the nature of the dollar and the not quite full American dinner pail rather than on any question of national expansion. McKinley's first act as president had nothing to do with the liberation of a subject people or the snagging of strategic islands in the Pacific. Rather, he summoned Congress to a special session to push American tariffs back to their customary Republican heights. The destruction of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, reshuffled the administration's priorities. Now the protection of United States power in the world increased. The projection of American power in the world increased. And Tsar Reed's reign as the autocrat of the House receded. There was no more orthodox a Republican than Reed on most articles of party doctrine. On women's suffrage, it's true, he was far out in front of the faithful. He believed that women should actually have the vote. Imagine that. And he drafted a constitutional amendment to make it so. To this gesture, by the way, his wife, Susan, responded with a snort of derision. There's a wonderful section in my book in which Reed reads aloud his constitutional amendment to his wife. And he describes her body language. She sits curled up on the sofa, curling tighter and tighter as if to somehow fend off these utterly embarrassing notions that her husband was. Anyway, the emancipation of women in those days was more a fancy of Reed's than a practical threat to party unity. The speaker's eccentric ideas on foreign policy posed a much more immediate danger to the McKinley administration's agenda. Reed opposed the national expansion, and even more vehemently than most Republicans asserted them. The 1896 Republican platform urged an aggressive application of the Monroe Doctrine. But there was nothing controversial about that. Only the year before, President Cleveland, a Democrat, had asserted America's hemispheric rights so forcefully in the matter of a Venezuelan border dispute as to open up the very real possibility of a war with Great Britain, which would have been highly embarrassing. The United States Navy had one ship. The Republican manifesto, however, did stand apart from the Democrats and the populists on other strategic questions. It proposed the construction of an American-operated canal through Nicaragua and the American control of the then independent Hawaiian Islands. It urged the U.S. to interpose itself between the Spanish colonial government of Cuba and the Cuban insurgents. This was the Republican platform. "We watch," said this document, "with deep and abiding interest the heroic battle of the Cuban patriots against cruelty and oppression, and our best hopes go out for the full success of their determined contest for liberty." The only thing we know for certain about those orotund phrases is that Thomas B. Reed did not write them. In his arguments for a bigger and better Library of Congress, Reed had said that, quote, "a great nation needed a great library." It was an uncharacteristic turn of phrase. And I am willing to bet that he would cringe if he were here this evening to hear himself so quoted. Reed was not so radical individualist as to assert that a great state is a contradiction in terms. He did not contend that greatness lay only in individuals. But he did believe that if a nation could achieve great things within its own boundaries, it was not therefore entitled to attempt to transplant these accomplishments in foreign soil or to force them down the throats of unwilling peoples. Preclusive imperialism was how the historian William L. Langer described the Louisiana Purchase. We got it to be rid of the French. So too with the annexation of Florida, which pushed Spain out of where it didn't belong, or that of Oregon, or that of Texas. The idea was always to eliminate the foreign obstacles to continental drift, as the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. put it. Henry Cabot Lodge, an unflinching GOP expansionist, wanted to carry the preclusive tradition all the way into the 20th century. Surveying a map of the Pacific, he thought that he could see the outstretched English hand reaching for every island. And if it wasn't the English hand, it was the German one. The great nations, wrote the Massachusetts senator in 1895, are rapidly absorbing for their future expansion and their present defense all the waste places of the earth. Waste places. Now, by the way, for you investors and financial people, waste places was the original term for emerging markets. And through a succession of marketing improvements, it became, lesser developed nations, third world nations, and finally, I guess emergent. I guess the next thing is emergent. Anyway, waste places was the term of art then. As one of the great nations of the world, the United States must not fall out of the line of march, so said Lodge. This was the same Lodge who in 1896 nominated Reed to be a Republican standard bearer at the GOP National Convention. The Republican Party indeed was a big tent in those days. Teddy Roosevelt, no shrinking violet in the foreign policy department, was himself a staunch Reed man. And here's what Roosevelt had to say about American engagement with the world. Quote, "If we shrink from the hard contests where men must win at the hazard of their lives and at the risk of all they hold dear, then the bolder and stronger peoples will pass us by and will win for themselves the domination of the world," close quote, yuck. The yuck was what Reed would have said if he were here tonight. That was Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was a Reed, but he loved Reed. Pretty plainly, Reed and the GOP were approaching a parting of the ways. The man from Maine wanted no part of the worldwide grab for imperial possessions, nor the choosing up of sides among and between the colony-grabbing European powers. In South Africa, his sympathies lay with the Boers, not the English. War itself sickened him. Reed served in the Civil War, and he held what is possibly the least martial military rank ever accorded a soldier or a sailor. Now, he was a supply officer, as we would call it today, but they didn't call it that. They called a paymaster, but it was worse. He wasn't merely a paymaster. He was an assistant paymaster, but it wasn't even that good. He was an acting assistant paymaster. I mean, might as well not put on the uniform. But Reed had no romantic notions about war. He wouldn't glorify it. May 30th, Memorial Day, was for him the day of the dead soldiers. And as for the ethics of seizing territory in a preclusive fashion, Reed likened it to picking up a wallet left lying on a bench, because if you didn't take it, somebody else would come along and pinch it. Reed made no secret of his views, though he rarely declared them. He had other means of expression. Early in 1897, a clear majority of the House supported a bill to construct the Nicaraguan Canal. This was years before the digging of the Panama Canal. Reed opposed it and the accompanying appropriation of tens of millions of dollars to begin work. He refused to let the bill come to the floor for a vote. the sponsors begged him to reconsider. They produced a petition signed by 60 Democrats and all but 20 Republicans. Thus, commented the editors of The Nation, quote, "We have the spectacle of a great majority of the representatives of the freest people on earth forbidden by one man even to speak on a bill which they are extremely desirous of passing." Well, that was Reed. That was Reed. As Ida Tarbell, the great muckraking journalist of the day, put it in her book on the tariff, he believed in doing what the majority wanted done when he agreed with the majority. But a majority of congressmen inflamed with war spirit is not so easily managed. The cause of the explosion aboard the Maine was presently determined to the satisfaction of William Randolph Hearst, if not to that of the official U.S. Navy Board of Inquiry. And on April 25th, 1898, Congress voted to make war on the Kingdom of Spain. In keeping with the tradition that the Speaker did not vote except to break a tie, Reed withheld his nay, but did tell one of the handful of dissenters how much he envied him the privilege of standing against the tide of imperialism. Incidentally, shortly after Reed's death, the Washington Post published an unsigned column about an unnamed detective who supposedly had been assigned to guard Reed from death threats just before the declaration of war, because Reed had become very unpopular by his opposition to this hugely popular enterprise against Spain. And the unnamed bodyguard wrote, "Speaker Reed is a giant of a stature. And when I reported for duty, I remarked to him, and I thought he was better able to take care of me than I am him." And now that the war was on, Republican agitation for the formal annexation of Hawaii became more persistent. They had to have Hawaii. Some nation would avail itself of the hospitality of Pearl Harbor, the annexationists argued. It would be strategically criminal if that nation were not the United States. Reed did nothing to impede the conduct and financing of the 109-day war, which he called the War of the Two Skirmishes, but he refused to bend on Hawaii. Snatching it, he believed, would deliver no tangible benefit, but would certainly mean the loss of a great political principle, that is, the principle of self-determination. Senator Richard Pettigrew of South Dakota was another Republican critic of McKinley's foreign policy, and he expressed his objections in a way that would certainly stand out today. The subject peoples of the Caribbean and the Pacific were not ready for self-government and might never be, said the senator from South Dakota, quote, "You can't make a white man and a banana grow on the same quarter section of land, and where bananas grow, there is no self-government," said the man from South Dakota. It would be a pleasure to say that Reed was above such racist jest, but there is archival evidence to the contrary. Not even a czar could resist the expansionist wave, and in May 1898, Reed allowed a resolution on Hawaiian annexation to reach the floor. The Speaker absented himself from the House on the day of the vote. He was under the weather, he said, but instructed the Speaker pro tem to announce that if he had been there at his post, he would have voted nay. Not that it seemed to matter. The motion carried 209 to 91. Reed was no longer the czar that he was, as the editors of The Nation rather gleefully pointed out. Quote, "The insurrection in Cuba set the House in insurrection," they wrote. The blowing up of the Maine blew up the fiction of the Speaker's supreme control legislation. Into the war, the House dragged him, protesting and struggling, and wild for annexation it rushed, in a way to prove that his supreme control was little more than the control over his own vote. The masterful Speaker was mastered. There was worse to come. To Reed's dying regret, the hero of Manila Bay, Commodore George Dewey, did not steam promptly home upon pummeling the Spanish defenders of the Philippines at the end of April 1898. But rather, Dewey stayed to entangle the United States in the last colonial curse of the Spanish Empire. It was a further source of sorrow to Reed that the U.S. took possession of the Philippines under the terms of the Treaty of Peace with Spain. $20 million was the cost to the American taxpayers of the islands that most, as Mr. Dooley, the fictional character that figured so largely in the political satire of the day, as Mr. Dooley observed, didn't know from canned goods. Reed by now was utterly estranged from the administration. Loyalty, party loyalty, precluded him from open opposition. But he could not have silenced his wit proudly, even if he had tried. More than once, an earlier biographer of Reed mentioned, he refused recognition for private bills carrying small appropriations on the ground that the, quote, money is needed for the melees. And when Congress appropriated $300,000 for the Philadelphia Commercial Museum, Reed remarked with a sigh, "This seems like a great waste of money. We could buy 15,000 naked natives with that." As the administration's $20 million accession for the Philippines came before his gaze, Reed remarked presciently, "We have bought 10 million Malays at $2 a head unpicked, and nobody knows what it will cost to pick them." The cost turned out to be 4,234 American military fatalities and $600 million in outlays in the Philippine War. The Philippine patriots, noting that their American liberators had gone to war to deliver Cuba from its Spanish overlord, not unreasonably expected that General Emilio Aguinaldo, the Philippine leader, would be allowed to establish a popular government in the Philippines. Indeed, Commodore Dewey had promised as much. Learning otherwise, the natives in the Philippines rose up against the American occupation. The ensuing war devolved into brutal hatred, as wars generally did, as Reed pointed out. To a friend, Reed wrote in 1902, "They were, these Filipinos, only a short time ago our wards, to whom we owed sacred duties, duties we could not abandon in the face of a censorious world without soiling our Christian fame. Now they are niggers, who must be punished for defending themselves. This is the history of the world, with perhaps a stronger dash of hypocrisy than usual to soothe our feelings." Congress without Reed was to many unthinkable. It was almost unthinkable to Reed, who loved the speakership and who at the age of 60 was no more ready than most others of the AARP time in life to overthrow deeply ingrained habits. Yet he realized that the Philippine Islands were bolted onto the national balance sheet. He could not go on as before. Reed retired from the House and from the speakership on March 3rd, 1899. To the public, he said nothing about his reason for leaving, but he freely disclosed it to his friends. To one, he said, "I have tried, perhaps not always successfully, to make the acts of my public life accord with my conscience, and I cannot do this thing." The press was desolated. The Washington Post, observing him in his final days in public life as large, bland, observant, and appraising the players at their genuine worth, could not imagine Congress without him. "Empire can wait," was the summation of Reed's personal foreign policy. But that policy was not his party's, and Reed would not openly criticize his party, though he was happy to let others infer what they might from his bland silences. The writer of an unsigned newspaper clipping in the Reed archives at Bowdoin College, identified only by date, September 1899, was one who got the message. "We are bound to say," said this anonymous newspaper guy, "that of all the methods of attacking the great and good McKinley which have been devised, that pursued by ex-Speaker Reed is the most dastardly. All that Mr. Reed does is to say that he believes in the Declaration of Independence and in the principles of liberty, self-government, and the rights of man." So Reed took up the practice of law in New York. He became a partner at Simpson Thacher, wrote often to his great good friend from Portland days, a fellow named George Gifford. And he wrote on his 10 Wall Street letterhead, "Dear George," he scrawled late, did Reed in 1899, "this afternoon I got into a case with 2 Standard Oil magnates for clients, and I ought to have happy deliverance, as the enemy seem to be weakening already. Of course, the event has been circulated, but this is preferable to exporting Kentucky civilization to foreign parts." The next summer, the same correspondent, Reed sounded wistful about his retirement. My idea, he wrote, I have expressed not in words but in action. For I have laid down great office, the routine of a lifetime which I could easily, so easily, have held on to both. Still, what was easy to people in my trade would not have been easy to me, and I do not repent. My first big case involving 1 million or 2, we have just run one root and branch, and I like my old trade, that is the trade of the law. Nevertheless, I would give it up gladly could I see success, not personal success, but success to the faith of our fathers. And Reed continued, what can you do with a world which says there is no imperialism because we shall give to the subjects in the new lands when they are fit for a government which will be suitable for them, and we will give them all that is good for them. A century and a quarter of liberty has not taught us what liberty is. So Thomas Reed died in Washington on December 6, 1902. He could feel death creeping up on him. In his letters to Gifford, his great friend, he often expressed regret he would not be around to see how things turned out. What a fearsome thing it is to wait the slow progress of the world, wrote Reed. It sometimes seems a pity that God has so much eternity to do things in, and that he needs each of us so little. It turned out, as Reed must have suspected, that empire could not wait after all. The nation that emerged victorious from its war with Spain would never again be so content in its own backyard. Reed stopped the Nicaraguan project, but not the Panama Canal nor the open door. Reed had been gone 10 years when Gifford, writing to Susan Reed, his wife, wondered what might have been. He said, did Gifford, had he been president instead of the weak and contemptible McKinley, with his ear to the ground to catch the cry of the people and the paroxysms of temporary mania, demanding war, conquest, and empire. What a different country we should have today. The nation would not have shrunk, expanded, as the imperialists foolishly call it, by the addition of millions of conquered, unwilling subjects. To me, as to many thousands of others, as I believe, the failure of the mass of the people to prefer the great to the little man, noble and lofty ideals to mean ones, was the severest disappointment of my whole long life. Well, the road not taken is always fun to travel, the scenery and the gas mileage, or anything and everything we can imagine. I'm a little less certain than Gifford about the Thomas B. Reed Highway to the future. I'm not sure that it would have led to the uplands of peace and tranquility. Of one thing I am certain, though, and that is that I would not like to be the one who had to explain to the former speaker on the battlements of heaven how the United States Central Command, that is the one branch only of the U.S. Department of Defense, came to hold responsibility, as the generals and admirals call it, for 27 countries and 665.6 million people in places the names of which not all of us can spell. I couldn't bear Reed's withering glance. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for listening.